Imagine a single house where the night hides more facts than the daylight ever will. A home whose walls have memorized screams, whispers, and the slow cracking of a family's sense of self. Picture that green lawn, those polite curtains, the facade of a life that could be printed on a postcard, and behind it a pattern that repeats itself like a poison recipe. Tonight I will pull back that curtain. I will take you step by step into a private catastrophe so intimate it rewrites the idea of heredity, discipline, and destiny. If you want the truth to take root in you, type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. And before we descend, do the thing you always do. Subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city and state. Because this is not a local myth. It is a warning to every family, every neighborhood, every generation. The Galvin house on Hidden Valley Road was never merely a collection of rooms. It was a crucible. It was a machine for producing obedience, reputation, and an illusion so complete the world could not believe its collapse. Donald and Mimi Galvin presented an American dream built with military precision. Strict rules, perfect manners, and social rituals stitched so tightly no one could see the stress lines beneath. Yet within that order, something older and more patient stirred, a genetic shadow, small and invisible at first, then spreading like ink through paper. Between 1945 and 1965, Mimi gave birth to 12 children, 10 boys, 2 girls. From the outside, they were model children, handsome, athletic, and polite. Inside, the household rhythm was a clinical experiment disguised as parenting. The eldest shines brightest, then crack, then the next. Patterns repeat. By the time the third bell tolls, you begin to see there is no accident here, only a family folded into history's cruel arithmetic. Stay with me. Subscribe, say your town, and watch how a small genetic ember ignited a blaze that would consume more than lives. It would consume truth. In this series, we'll trace each brother's unraveling, the institutional handshakes that smoothed over crimes, and the quiet commerce of reputation that protected the powerful. This is not voyeurism. It's instruction. Learn the signs before they teach them to you. Remember, stay sharp. When the first son began to dissolve, the family called it stress. They named it our phase, and wrapped it in the language of care, because to admit otherwise would be to confess a failure that would stain their standing. Donald Jr. seemed inevitable, athletic, magnetic, the boy who carried the household's pride. But inside him a different narrative was gestating, quietly growing in the family line. He heard threads where there were none, hidden messages in textbooks, signals in streetlights, conspiracies in the margins of life. He paced in deliberate patterns for hours, eyes hollow with a focus that frightened his sisters and baffled his teachers. A campus bonfire exposed the fissure, a fevered leap into flames that left him burned, silent, and altered. The family offered explanations: homesickness, stress, because to say otherwise would be to shatter the image they curated. The military father used connections to hush reports. The mother folded panic into schedules and lists. But genetics is a stubborn logic. It cannot be reasoned out of its expression. The second son followed a quieter, meticulous arc. Obsession folded into music, into rooms wallpapered with clippings and string until the walls spoke back. He self-harmed in rituals meant to quiet voices, carving protection into flesh. Where one brother's collapse was a public flame, another's was a long erosion. Institutions arrived with their scripts, labels, pills, procedures that treated snapshots, not continuums. Doctors named symptoms. They rarely asked about the long shadow that linked brother to brother. Community gossip compressed complexity into denial and protected appearances. In the gaps left by those protections, the illness migrated, not as fate but as consequence. Genetic risk met social denial, and the result was catastrophe. The early hospitalizations offered a veneer of action: admission papers, polite doctors, neat hospital corridors. It felt like intervention, but often it was paperwork that allowed the family to continue its performance. Medications dulled rage. They also obscured the truth by making brilliant minds into patients. Teachers, pastors, and neighbors stepped back, unwilling to interrogate a family that had given them so much social capital. Every outward nod to normalcy became a brick in a wall that hid the true scale of suffering inside. Institutional forgetting consumed them. Subscribe now, write your city in the comments, and then breathe. If you are still sitting there, the truth you are about to hear was once confined to whispered family stories, to hushed sessions with doctors, and to psychiatric records that rarely saw the light. After Donald Jr. and James began their collapses, the pattern accelerated. Brian arrived on a different schedule, fast, violent, unpredictable. He believed himself chosen, he believed rituals could transform him. His rage was not aimless, it was theological, an uncompromising conviction that he was waging war against forces invisible to everyone else. He attacked as if following a script no one had authorized, leaving the family scurrying to invent reasons. One brother became a public danger, one a withdrawn prophet, another a whispered accusation in the nights. Joseph, quiet and inward, spoke of shadows and secret messages, of warnings that read like prophecies. The sisters learned to sleep with a chair braced against the door. They learned how to silence their bodies so that the household would not notice the tremors beneath its enforced calm. And yet the outside world kept assuming that the family had simply issues it could manage with therapy appointments and weekend visits. Inside, the household economy of secrecy hardened into rules: do not tell neighbors, do not admit failure, protect father's honor, keep mother's narrative intact. The family's social currency bought silence. The church, the school, the doctor, each had a role in maintaining appearances. And where systems are porous, people with power extract advantages. Insurance forms became a way to funnel patients into categories that made data neat and unpleasant truths disappear. Children who should have had advocacy were left to drift between wards, foster programs, and private homes because no one wanted to upset the public version of a good family. As researchers would later learn, those threads were not random. They linked genes to care systems, stigma to outcomes, and silence to the very mechanisms that mismanaged men who needed truth and care. Now listen as the quiet becomes violent, as private rituals turn lethal. Brian's collapse did not occur in a vacuum. It was the confluence of an inherited dark code and a household that had normalized secrecy. His aggression found targets: lovers, strangers, anyone who punctured the narrative he'd constructed in his mind. One night, performed like an act of grim devotion, Brian strangled the fragile boundary between belief and action. In public he smiled and answered questions politely. In private he enacted prophecies. The police found him calm after the act, articulate, convinced that he had performed purification. The system responded with arrest and detention, but also with the familiar scripts: insanity pleas, psychiatric evaluations, and the same slow churn of hospital corridors that had become a family's second home. The next blow came like a legal machine: trial preparations, media framing that reduced complexity to headlines, and a justice system ill-equipped to pass the mixture of pathology and responsibility. Before the trial could expose the family to further public humiliation, Brian was found dead in his cell. A statutory end that would be explained as suicide and then filed away as another casualty of mental illness. But even in death, the questions multiplied rather than resolved. How much did the system fail him? How much did the family architecture encourage him? Where did genetic fate end and social design begin? The Galvin house now stood as both crime scene and laboratory. 2 brothers dead, multiple lives shattered, and still the neighborhood refused to converse honestly about what had happened behind tidy doors. Rumors ossified into versions of events that serviced the comfortable. This was a family tragedy, nothing more. Yet among professionals a very different conversation was beginning. Researchers noted a cluster, not random but patterned, and in those notes they found permission to dig deeper. Little by little, clinicians and scientists began to suspect a genetic thread. The case would reshape conversations about heredity, responsibility, and how institutions measure human suffering. Pay attention. Before we continue and go deeper, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, city, state, because this tale is a mirror for any community. Then lean in. Scientists came calling not because they wanted scandal, but because they smelled pattern. A psychiatric researcher, compelled by cases that defied existing explanations, began to listen to a family that had been muffled by its own pride. She saw not only the clinical notes but the family ledger of births, hospitalizations and funerals, and there in the margins were signals that demanded genomic exploration. The family agreed, desperate for answers, for absolution, for a reason that could be measured and maybe even prevented. Blood samples were taken, interviews recorded, and personal histories transcribed with a cold precision that contrasted with the raw, human mess of the Galvin kitchen table. The research process read like a forensic autopsy of fake DNA, psychological profiles, and a patient-by-patient excavation of who these men had been before the illness flattened them. For Mimi, who had spent decades blaming herself, it was both relief and a new kind of grief. To discover that you had passed a predisposition to your children is a vindication against the tyranny of accusation, and yet it is its own sentence. Researchers tracked a mutation, a tiny alteration in a gene that correlated with the affected brothers. It was not a dramatic single answer, but a whisper of biological susceptibility, a vulnerability that interacted with environment and parenting and trauma. As labs replicated findings and academic papers started to appear, the Galvin family moved from being a private disaster to a public paradigm. The discovery reframed questions of blame and cure, of care and prevention. But discovery did not mean closure. Scientific language can exonerate the living from moral fault, yet it cannot resurrect the dead or cleanse the memory of childhoods spent under threat. The family's story was being written into textbooks even as the living tried to stitch together new lives. The implications spread into public health, prenatal guidance, nutrient research, and a rethinking of how medicine supports families at genetic risk. Practical steps from theory. When research names a cause, life doesn't neatly rearrange itself to match the papers. For the surviving brothers, the discovery was both a doorway and a mirror. It explained why some of their bloodlines had faltered, but it also forced them to confront the ways institutions had failed to protect the vulnerable. Medication regimes that stabilized psychosis often carried collateral damage, metabolic collapse, organ failure, lethargy that ate at personality. Some men who had been vivacious were reduced to shells by the very treatments meant to help them. Insurance authorizations determined who could get private therapy and who cycled through public wards. Families with resources often navigated the system better. Those without sank. The Galvins had some advantages: social capital, connections, and a mother who knew how to marshal professionals. But those advantages could not stop the attrition of spirit that came with repeated hospitalizations, court appearances, and the social ostracism that followed publicized episodes. The sisters, who had survived years of threat and harm, became activists in a world that treated mental health like an afterthought. They learned legislative vocabulary, grant writing, and the politics of research funding. They begged for attention for the kind of childhood trauma that rarely made it into academic journals. But activism is also grief work. It cannot fully replace the lost years or the brothers who never returned from hospitals. Some of the family members sought solace in new communities, others in religion, and some in silence. And still the larger systems moved slowly. Medical practice updated guidelines, genetic counseling entered conversations, and until very recently, prenatal advice considered nutrient support that might buffer brain development. Yet these advances felt like small repairs when measured against decades of pain. The narrative that began on Hidden Valley Road had seeped into research centers, into classrooms, and into policy debates. Survivors carried guilt like an extra limb, an inheritance of sorrow. Legacy is complicated. It can instruct future prevention or ossify into shame that haunts descendants for generations. We must learn from them. Hit subscribe now and tell me the town you're watching from. Your voice matters because this is a story about every town. The neighborhood knew two faces of the Galvins, the polished family at church and the family with doors never quite closed. Neighbors described odd hours, quiet arguments, and sometimes the flicker of police lights. But communities are protective of their own reputations and of the myths that stabilize daily life. So they preferred to whisper rather than interrogate. Police interventions were episodic and often perfunctory: calm the scene, escort a brother to hospital, update a report. These actions looked like care, but what they rarely achieved was long-term protection. Law enforcement operated on visible behaviors. Mental illness often hides in the gray areas between crime and medical crisis. Courts similarly lack tools. Insanity defenses and competency assessments are blunt instruments that cannot dissect the interplay of genetics, trauma, and family structure. Social services scrambled to provide beds, guardianship and supervision, but they were underfunded and reactive. That created an ecosystem where repeated crises became normalized. The tragedy of Hidden Valley Road exposes how public systems can enable private collapse by failing to connect dots early. When children are moved between facilities, when guardianship changes hands, when medication regimens are interrupted by bureaucracy, risk multiplies. Meanwhile, the family, trapped by pride and terror, kept the story in a tight loop to avoid stigma. The result, people who needed consistent, compassionate care slid through cracks. And yet there were flashes of decency. Nurses who stayed late to sit with frightened men, therapists who pushed for family meetings, advocates who fought insurance companies for continuity of care. Those moments were islands of humanity in a sea of systemic fatigue. Today, if you look beyond headlines, you'll find policy proposals that aim to close those cracks: crisis intervention teams, integrated care models and community-based supports that keep people out of jail and in treatment. But policy is slow. Change is a negotiation between resources and will. Cultural stigma compounds the harm. Families hide illness to avoid shame, so early detection fails. If you are watching, subscribe and tell me your city. Demand better from your systems. This must not repeat elsewhere. Type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments to solidify what you now know. Public attention arrived like weather, unstoppable, indifferent, and capable of eroding truth into spectacle. As researchers published findings, journalists came to translate complex science into headlines. Some told the story with rigor, others sought the grotesque angle because outrage attracts eyes. The family, already raw, found itself objectified, tragedy rebranded as data points and narrative hooks. Consent in research is messier than textbooks admit. People who have suffered choose to participate, hoping their pain will be meaningful. But media and institutions sometimes take that meaning and convert it into entertainment. Whole biographies were composed out of therapy notes. Interviews that began as a search for help became public artifacts. Ethical questions surfaced: how to study without re-traumatizing, how to protect identities while sharing findings that could help millions. Scientists wrestled with the tension between urgency and caution. The answers were provisional. Papers recommended more research, training modules were updated, legal ethics committees wrote stricter consent forms. Yet the living experienced another effect. Being studied accelerated the family's public dissection, exposing private grief to legislative debates and grant cycles. The Galvin story, in this sense, became a case about attention itself, attention that can heal when focused and informed, or harm when sensationalized. The sisters who had become advocates discovered that visibility is a double-edged sword. It creates platforms to push for resources, but it also reopens wounds on loop. Meanwhile, the medical community debated clinical utility. Knowing there is a mutation matters, but it does not always translate into care pathways that are affordable or available. Genetic counseling emerged as important, yet access was uneven. Communities with means could secure private counseling and continuous support. Others were left with pamphlets and phone numbers that rang unanswered. The social lens here is crucial. Science alone cannot repair structural inequalities that turn discovery into privilege. History shows that institutions sometimes bury inconvenient truths to maintain power. Reputations, grants, and the appearance of control can all trump courage. We must hold systems accountable, insist on transparency, and demand that knowledge be married to justice and accessible care. Act now. The heart of this calamity was not only the gene but the family narrative. How Mimi's obsession with perfection became a frame, and Donald Sr.'s disciplined absence became an editing tool that excised tenderness. They were not villains in a melodrama. They were people operating under cultural and personal pressures that shaped parenting decisions with decades-long consequences. Mimi's record-keeping and rituals were attempts at control. If life could be catalogued and ordered, it could be managed. But some things, genetic susceptibilities, the accidents of early brain development, the timing of adolescence, refused tidy entries into a logbook. Donald's military bearing enforced silence. Failures were hidden, emotions were contained, grief was recoded as duty. The children learned to perform normalcy as survival. That performance litigated how outsiders perceived them. It also delayed intervention. Years of suppressed fear and sporadic compassion accumulate into complex trauma. The siblings who did not develop psychosis found themselves caretakers by default, responsible for navigating hospitals, managing medications, and patching fissures within relationships their parents had been unequipped to heal. This dynamic can be corrosive. Caregivers burn out, resent, or internalize a guilt that fractures marriages and careers. The sisters sometimes became the family's memory keepers, chroniclers of what happened and why. They carried material traces, letters, photographs, and medical records, and they became translators between the medical world and the everyday life that made little sense to clinicians. Those who inherited healthy minds still inherited the aftermath: legal tangles, financial drains, and the social stigma that followed public episodes. Family secrets, once exposed, do not vanish. They demand reconciliation, which is a slow, often impossible labor. Reconciliation requires confrontation with shame and error, an acceptance of vulnerability that many institutions distrust. Rebuilding lives after such rupture is not a straight line. It is a series of small recoveries: a good day, a reliable therapist, a stable housing placement, a pardon from oneself. The Galvin family's path contained all these small workaday salvations, punctuated by losses that could never be fully repaired. Society must fund long-term support, family therapy, and early intervention programs so that another family does not repeat this arc. Honor them by acting locally today. Before we go further, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. City and state. The end of the public dramas did not mean peace. Medical records show long convalescences, repeated institutional stays, and eventual placements that felt more like warehouses than homes for men who had once been full of promise. Some brothers lived out decades of quiet decline in facilities, their personalities eroded by years of medication and institutional routine. Others carved out lives of remarkable resilience, jobs, marriages, children, while carrying the invisible tax of survivor guilt. In the community of researchers, the Galvin case became a touchstone. Papers cited, grants were written, and new labs opened to study how genes interact with environment to produce mental illness. The discovery of a genetic variation linked to susceptibility reframed public conversation. It also raised thorny ethical questions about stigma for descendants. If a family carries a mutation, how does that affect offspring? Should prospective parents be screened? Who gets access to that information, and how will insurers react? The sisters lobbied for protections, for policies that would ensure genetic knowledge does not translate into discrimination. They argued for privacy, for counseling, for social safety nets that allowed families to choose care without fear. The advocates won some reforms: modest and incremental, better crisis response teams, more integrated care systems, and increased funding for early intervention programs. But many structural problems remained. The marketization of health care meant that continuity of care still depended on resources. Public interest waxed and waned. The case slid from headlines to footnotes, even as the work of prevention continued in clinics and labs. For the family, each reform was a mixed blessing. Scientific recognition validated their suffering and gave names to what had been whispered, but it did not return the years stolen by hospital stays, nor did it fully repair the psychological injury. The legacy is double-edged. It forced society to pay attention, and it exposed families to new vulnerabilities. Ongoing research, refined treatments, and community education programs taught early warning signs. Still, prevention requires political will and funding, things that fluctuate with headlines, not with need. Share this story, organize, and pressure leaders to fund prevention now. Once a family becomes a subject of science, it becomes part of a lineage of knowledge, but also part of a lineage of consequence. Genetic counseling arrived with the promise of information and the peril of foreknowledge. Couples who carried risk variants faced hard questions about reproduction and responsibility. Insurance companies and employers, sensing new categories, sometimes stumbled toward discrimination before laws caught up. The sisters' activism pushed for protections, for GINA-like safeguards, and for social programs that would allow people to make reproductive choices without fear. Yet legal shields are partial remedies. Culture shifts slowly. Stigmas persist. Children of affected families sometimes grew up with the shadow of expectation. Perhaps you will crack as well, the inner narrative whispered. That fear can be as damaging as the illness itself, altering life choices in subtle ways. Who you date, what professions you consider, whether you choose to have children at all. The ripple effects of the Galvin saga were generational. Beyond policy, there were philosophical questions. If a mutation confers susceptibility, what obligations do scientists have to ensure that knowledge is actionable? If knowledge alone does not create capacity, who is accountable for building the capacity? The scientific community is often best at discovery and worst at distribution. Breakthroughs must be translated into practical access, community clinics, trained counselors, and funding streams that sustain long-term support. Meanwhile, the families who had been studied faced an existential dilemma. Does participating in research mean sacrificing privacy for the greater good? Some family members wanted anonymity, others wanted the spotlight to generate urgency. The dynamic exposed a fundamental truth: knowledge is a social act. It does not live in labs alone. Researchers entered classrooms and town halls. They spoke in policy forums and in quiet meetings with sibling caregivers. In those rooms, science met humanity and sometimes stumbled. The lessons were messy but essential. Avoid paternalism, prioritize informed consent, and design interventions that center families rather than treating them like specimens. Learn this lesson before another family pays the price. We must widen the lens. The Galvin case did not happen in a vacuum. It unfolded against a century of ideas about heredity, social worth, and the reach of institutions into private life. In the early 20th century, governments and medical bodies flirted with simplistic narratives that equated genetics with destiny. By mid-century, psychiatry was still learning to disentangle biology from environment, and families like the Galvins found themselves caught in that transition. The result was a cultural readiness to both stigmatize and institutionalize profit-seeking behaviors within some sectors of care, the charging of fees for treatments that offered hope rather than certainty, the elevation of lab discoveries into commodities without ensuring equitable distribution, created moral hazards. Institutions sometimes prioritized reputational protection over radical transparency. Hospitals fought lawsuits, universities protected grants, administrations preferred calm headlines to inconvenient truths. The effect was a soft censorship, data hoarded, stories sanitized, and structural problems minimized. Likewise, the politics of mental health funding reflected broader biases. Investment followed visibility. Disorders that generated headlines saw resources, those that remained in family closets did not. Understanding this structural story matters because it shows how a family's quiet ruin can be multiplied by systemic choices. Ancient corruption need not be dramatic, it can be bureaucratic, a slow, rational calculus that yields injustice through neglect. Suppressed truths become habit, clinical guidelines that avoid difficult conversations, funding calls that prefer optimism to grim reality, and community leaders who prefer reputation to reform. The antidote is not merely outrage, but design. If we redesign systems so that they reward transparency, prioritize continuity of care, and fund prevention consistently, then knowledge can become a lever, not a cudgel. Practical reforms exist: integrated community mental health centers, crisis teams paired with social services, judicial diversion programs, and guaranteed continuity of medication during custody transfers. Advocacy groups have pushed for transparency rules in hospitals and for open data policies that do not sacrifice privacy. Push for these changes locally. Hold hospitals, labs, and governments to standards that protect families rather than protect reputations now. Not all threads ended in ruin. Some of the Galvin brothers who remained outwardly healthy built lives that looked ordinary. Jobs, marriages, children. But ordinary is a thin word for what they had to manufacture. They carried the invisible labor of caregiving, scheduling appointments, negotiating with insurers, and living with the constant fear that their own minds might one day betray them. These brothers often became advocates in small, private ways, mentoring neighbors, volunteering, and quietly supporting mental health initiatives in their communities. They found approaches that worked for them: steady employment with benefits, social networks that stayed loyal even through public episodes, and therapy that emphasized stability over spectacle. The two sisters transformed their lives into public service, not for notoriety, but to create pathways they had lacked. They lectured, testified before committees, formed non-profits, and pushed for research funding aimed at prevention rather than post-hoc analysis. Their activism was practical and personal: support groups for siblings, funds for early intervention programs, and scholarships for students studying psychiatric care. That work did not erase trauma, but it converted pain into purpose. For the wider public, the family story became a catalyst. Medical curricula started to include family systems training, social work programs emphasized continuity of care, and some hospitals revised protocols for handling family crises. Yet even with these wins, private sorrow remained. Siblings fought and forgave, lost spouses and remarried, and wrestled with questions that have no neat answers. Could things have been different? Did choices make matters worse? Are we obliged to pass on this knowledge to descendants? These moral questions visited family members in late-night reflections and holiday dinners. Some descendants chose not to have children to avoid risking transmission. Others embraced parenthood with counseling and monitoring. The families who engaged science found benefits in early screening and in interventions that sometimes mitigated severe outcomes. But access to such care was uneven, contingent on money and geography. Many small victories accumulated over years: stable housing placements, reliable medication management, and community acceptance that made ordinary days possible. These quiet wins are the hard currency of survival. Honor them by acting locally today. Consider the idea of psychological control as infrastructure. It is not necessarily sinister in intention. Often it is a set of routines, expectations, and rewards that channel behavior. In the Galvin household, rituals operated like a governance system: obedience rewarded with affection, deviation sanctioned by withdrawal, and reputation enforced by social scripts. These systems are efficient at preserving family narratives, but brutal when they meet genetic vulnerability. Behavioral norms that keep a community functioning can become instruments of suppression for those whose minds diverge from the expected pattern. Think of it as a civilization-level policy applied to one household: rules, monitoring, punishment, and the transformation of care into compliance. When psychiatry began to intervene, it sometimes translated rebellion into symptoms rather than listening for meaning. Hospitalization can function like administrative containment: beds, locks, and schedules that prioritize risk management over personal dignity. The brothers' behaviors were catalogued and remediated, but rarely were the control mechanisms themselves interrogated, which is to say, we treated the output more than the system that produced the output. This is a critical failure mode. Psychological control systems also extend beyond families. Schools reward conformity, workplaces punish difference, and legal systems criminalize behaviors that are often expressions of distress. Thus, a vulnerable person navigates multiple control systems simultaneously, each designed to maintain order, not necessarily to heal. Deprogramming such systems requires structural changes: family therapy that questions power dynamics, schools trained to accommodate neurodiversity, workplaces that offer flexibility, and a criminal justice system focused on diversion. These are big changes, but they are precisely the kinds of interventions that could have altered the Galvin trajectory. Recognize that the machinery of daily life can amplify biological vulnerabilities into tragedies. Understanding control systems is not about blaming individuals. It is about redesigning environments so that difference does not become a death sentence. Practical steps matter: integrate trauma, informed schooling, mandate diversion instead of incarceration, expand community clinics, and create oversight that prioritizes continuity of care. Fund those policies so awareness becomes action. When communities learn to treat difference with dignity rather than suspicion, genetic vulnerability no longer guarantees tragedy. It becomes managed risk through resources and love. Subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. This matters because stories like this demand communal reckoning. Over time, the Galvin saga entered public literature: books, interviews, documentaries that sought to contextualize the pain and translate it for a wider audience. Some accounts honored complexity, others reduced nuance in favor of narrative clarity. The effect was a double-edged spotlight: attention that propelled research funding, but also a cultural appetite for the macabre details of familial collapse. Authors and filmmakers faced ethical choices when narrating lives still raw with loss. How do you tell such a story without exploiting it? How do you interrogate the systems that failed a family without making the family into props for an argument? The best work balanced curiosity with restraint, centering the voices of survivors, protecting privacy where requested, and using publicity to advocate for policy change. Popular interest drove conversations in classrooms, legislative hearings, and hospital committees. The case reshaped psychiatric training and pushed geneticists to pursue translational research that might actually change outcomes. Yet there is always a tension between storytelling and reform. Stories can mobilize empathy. They can also satiate voyeurism and leave systems unchanged. The most consequential narratives are those that catalyze institutions to act, to fund programs, to change care protocols, to provide oversight. The Galvin family's appearance in popular culture was therefore a test case. Would attention result in lasting commitments or momentary sympathy? The partial answer is mixed. Some reforms stuck. Crisis teams funded, genetic counseling made more accessible in certain regions, and community education programs initiated. But in many places, momentum waned as headlines faded. That fickleness is not merely disappointing, it is dangerous. Structural change requires sustained advocacy and accountability. Decades later, descendants of affected families sometimes transform pain into profession, pursuing psychiatry, social work, policy, and law to prevent recurrence. They are living evidence that tragedy can seed reform, but only when society gives them the resources to build. Advocacy is a marathon, not a sprint. If you want the Galvin story to mean something, turn curiosity into commitment, volunteer, donate, and lobby for laws that protect genetic privacy, ensure medication continuity, and fund long-term community mental health locally. What does this case demand from us as moral beings? It asks that we interrogate the pleasure we take in unraveling dark stories, and the comfort we find in explanations that name culprits and close curtains. True moral labor is harder. It is public pressure, institutional rework, and the unstinting commitment to care that costs money and political capital. The story of the Galvins forces us to confront a recurring dynamic in history. When knowledge appears, institutions often default to preservation, of reputation, of funding, of coherence, rather than to repair. That is the corruption the archive reveals, not necessarily the melodramatic conspiracy, but the slow arithmetic of choices that prioritize image over intervention. To call that corruption ancient is to insist it is persistent, embedded in bureaucracies and social habits that resist exposure. The opposite of that corruption is a different set of habits: transparency, redistribution, and humility. Transparency without action is meaningless. Redistribution without oversight is wasteful. Humility without systems is impotent. We must demand all three. Psychologically, the case reminds us that families and institutions co-create reality. Rules intended to create order can become mechanisms of control that silence suffering, and silence breeds mythologies, stories people tell to survive that can calcify into false narratives if never challenged. Part of the moral work, then, is to give voice to survivors while also translating their testimony into policy and practice. That requires institutions that listen, that measure outcomes over decades, and that place lived experience at the center of program design. It also means funding long-term studies that follow families not just through episodes but through lifetimes. Only with sustained patient inquiry will we know how to prevent repeats. Practically, demand crisis teams with mental health clinicians, insist on continuous medication access during custodial changes, fund family-centric therapy programs, and protect genetic privacy by law. Be brave enough to replace shame with structured care. Forbidden knowledge becomes a tool when matched with policy, otherwise it is voyeurism. Act locally, meet school officials, attend council meetings, support clinics, and amplify survivor voices until systems change now. Subscribe, drop your city below, and prepare to make a promise. This story must change you. The Galvin legacy is not a relic, it is a living manual about how communities succeed or fail at protecting the vulnerable. Today, we have tools that previous generations lacked: digital monitoring, telemedicine, sophisticated genetics, and better crisis coordination. But tools without commitments are toys. We must translate capability into consistent care. Start by educating yourself, learn early warning signs, know how to contact crisis teams in your county, and train to be a first responder in the emotional sense, someone who listens without blame. At the institutional level, push for policies that ensure continuity of care when people move between systems, mandate training for police who respond to mental health crises, and increase funding for programs that keep families intact rather than breaking them apart through incarceration. At the policy level, insist on genetic privacy protections, on legislation that prevents insurers from denying coverage based on genetic markers, and on programs that fund long-term family support. Individual actions scale when coordinated. Churches can host support groups, schools can embed mental health curricula into their programs, and employers can offer mental health days without stigma. But there is also a deeper, psychological change required. We must transform how we talk about difference. Replace mockery with curiosity, contempt with care. That shift erodes the social control mechanisms that make people hide symptoms and delay help. If enough communities do this, we will not merely react more effectively. We will have prevented some tragedies from starting. This is a hard, audacious hope, but it is not naive. It is practical. Volunteer at local mental health organizations. Attend training for crisis intervention. Lobby for school counselors and community clinics. Fund scholarships for mental health professionals who commit to underserved areas. And support legislation that ensures medication continuity during legal transitions. Teach your children compassion and teach your neighbors how to ask, "Are you okay?" Small actions aggregate into systems. If you pledge to act, email your council, join a local advocacy group, and keep the conversation alive. Do this, and honor those whose voices were silenced by neglect and secrecy. Healing is not a single event, it is a practice. Families learn to live with memory and to build rituals that replace secrecy with community. For some Galvin descendants, healing meant therapy and connection. For others, it meant distance and strict boundaries. Forgiveness, when it arrived, was uneven and fragile. It did not absolve the past. It rewired relationships so that care could be offered without constant accusation. The practical components of healing are straightforward. If politically challenging, stable housing, access to mental health professionals, financial help for long-term care, and social services integrated across systems so families do not fall between bureaucratic cracks. There is also a spiritual or existential component. Survivors must make meaning from suffering, often transforming private pain into public purpose. The sisters' conversion of trauma into advocacy is a moral model. They use their grief to open funding streams and to lobby for laws that protect others. Even so, small losses accumulate. Birthdays missed, relationships strained, opportunities lost. A family's timeline becomes a ledger of what was sacrificed and what was saved. Research continues. Newer techniques in genomics, neuroimaging, and preventive psychiatry aim to identify risk earlier and support interventions tailored to individuals. Yet science cannot replace civic will. Laboratories can identify risk markers. Only communities can ensure those findings translate into care that is equitable and non-stigmatizing. This means continued funding, oversight, and public education. It also means that when a family asks for help, our first reaction should not be suspicion, but a plan. Who will help? What services are needed next week? And how can continuity be ensured? Those pragmatic questions create pathways away from catastrophe. The Galvin legacy teaches that answers require urgency paired with patience. The work is both immediate and generational. Build coalitions. Parents, clinicians, educators, and policy makers must meet regularly to audit care. Support peer-led programs where siblings and survivors train professionals about lived experience. Fund long-term cohort studies that follow families across decades to learn which interventions genuinely reduce risk. Normalize mental health checkups the way we normalize vaccinations. When communities institutionalize compassion with budgets and metrics, they create durable safety nets. This is how you honor the Galvin family. In the end, forbidden knowledge loses its power when it is shared responsibly. The impulse to hoard secrets protects some people and harms others. The Galvin story reveals the moral duty to distribute difficult truths with care, to make them accessible to those who can change outcomes, and to protect those who might be harmed by premature exposure. That means building systems where knowledge is accompanied by support. When a genetic risk is identified, counselors, financial aid, and community resources should be immediately available. It means oversight bodies that evaluate whether research benefits subjects and whether media coverage respects dignity. It means families having legal recourse when their stories are misused. But there is also an interior task: identity shifts. Listening to this case should alter how you view vulnerability. Stop equating suffering with moral failing. Realize that extraordinary resilience often lies next to profound fragility. Let the Galvin narrative reconfigure your assumptions about inheritance, about blame, and about the way we value human life. If you feel your identity tighten in response, defensive, dismissive, indifferent, this narrative is working. Identity work is the small, private theater where cultural change begins. Change your phrases at the dinner table, your habits in the workplace, your reactions in the classroom. Teach children the vocabulary of compassion. Replace jokes about crazy with language that invites help. Talk openly about mental health and model seeking care. These are modest acts, but when multiplied, they become systems. Demand that your public institutions report outcomes publicly. Hospitals should publish continuity of care metrics. Schools should show counselor-to-student ratios, and police should report diversion program results. Advocate for universal mental health screenings in pediatric visits, and for paid family leave that allows caregivers to support loved ones without ruin. Support legislation that incentivizes professionals to work in underserved areas and scholarships that commit graduates to rural and inner-city clinics. Hold research institutions accountable, require community advisory boards for studies involving families, and ensure participants have access to results, counseling, and resources. Practice courage when you see a neighbor struggling. Intervene with care, not judgment. A society is judged by how it treats its most fragile. The Galvin story calls us to build systems that will stand when people fall. Before you close this video, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Your place matters because change starts locally. If you have followed this story from the opening image, you have witnessed a profound sequence of families shaped by habit, genetics, and social design, institutions that alternately helped and enabled, science that discovered causes but could not alone repair the harm. What do we carry forward? First, humility. We must accept that our systems are imperfect and that loving people is harder than naming culprits. Second, responsibility. If you are in a position to influence policy, healthcare, education, or law enforcement, do not defer for convenience. Third, practice. Small repeated acts of compassion, checking in, offering support, voting for funding, accrue into real protection. For men who watch this, identities can be remade. Strength is not stoicism, it is the courage to seek help, to support others, and to refuse the scripts that make vulnerability shameful. If you are a parent, learn signs early and insist on proactive care. If you are a neighbor, refuse to gossip, instead, build a safety net. If you are a policymaker, fund continuity of care and crisis teams. The Galvin family paid an enormous price so that we might see the intersection of heredity and neglect. Their names should not be a macabre curiosity, but a moral curriculum. Make that curriculum practical. Fund community clinics, insist on genetic privacy laws, and pressure institutions to publish outcomes and ensure continuity of care during transitions. This is not melodrama, it is civic work. Finally, change does not come from passive viewing. Convert your shock into deeds. Subscribe, leave your city in the comments, and pick one concrete action you will take this month. A call to a council member, a donation, a volunteer shift, a training session. Do it and report back. Accountability breeds momentum. The legacy of Hidden Valley Road is heavy, but we can carry it differently. With honesty, with resources, and with relentless, ordinary compassion. Make a promise. Teach your children that asking for help is strength. Reform your institutions to reward care. Do not let curiosity be voyeurism. Let it be the engine of policy and empathy. We are the stewards now. This is our moment to turn tragedy into a robust culture of care. Begin today.